Let's discuss the use of props for production. What is a prop? Technically, we could define it as anything that is moved about on stage or on a film set. Most typically, that means moved by an actor on stage as part of the action of the show. Prop is short for the word properties, and that dates back to the origination of properties when companies owned all their properties, and therefore some companies were better companies because they had better props than other companies did. They owned them. We can break props into 4 loose categories, and we'll discuss them a little bit more later on. There are set props. These are large pieces that are used by actors, like furniture pieces. Hand props, smaller items that are handled and used by the actors. Set dressing or decorative props, which are close to set props, except they're not going to be sat upon or moved around or actually used on stage. They're just there to dress the set to make it look realistic or appropriate for the environment. And costume props, things like glasses or armor, or gun holsters. These are all things that might fall into costumes but are generally handled in relation with the prop shop. Here's an example of a film or a television set. And let's look at what we would call the set props in this picture. We would say the sofa, the table and chairs. These are all going to be interactive with the actors. They're going to use them. They're going to move them around a little bit. Those are all set props. Hand props. There are lots of hand props in this scene, depending, of course, if the actors actually use them. But there is a cake sitting in front of the actress on the couch that may be eaten as part of the action of this scene. There are books around the apartment. There is a bottle of alcohol sitting on the counter that might be carried over and used as part of the scene. Those all become hand props in this part of the show. Set dressing. Now, some of those items may actually be a set dressing. If the cake is never actually touched or even used, but it was referred to somewhere in the show so it had to be there, then it's now a set dressing. It's just there to help set the mood or set the plot action of the show. If we look around the apartment, there's a clock on the wall, there's pictures on the wall, there's books on the bookshelf, there are items sitting around on the counter in the kitchen. Those are all set dressing. The actors probably won't interact with them, but they're there to help establish the environment. And then costume props. We note that there is a jacket on both of these characters. Now, at the top of the scene, one of those may have been lying on the couch, and therefore it was a costume prop that was going to be picked up and put on, working in conjunction with the prop people, obviously. But we might look around the room and there might be a watch somewhere, or there may be a purse somewhere, or a handkerchief, or even the cloth that's on the sofa that they may cover themselves up in. They can become costume props. What that simply means is, as a prop person, I would work with the costume designer specifically in making sure that piece works with the rest of the costumes. Why would props be important? First of all, they help create a dominant visual motif. In that last picture, I think we noticed that apartment looks lived in because it has all the props, all the dressing props and some of the set props and some of the hand props sitting around, and therefore it makes it look like it's lived in and owned by one of the characters. Props are often the primary design tool that we use to get clues about the personality and the socio and economic status of the inhabitants of that environment. Then that last picture we looked at, that was an apartment, and I think it said something about the fluency of the people who lived there. It said something about their choices. It said something about their personalities because of the way they chose to dress up their environment. The props can also be an important part of the action. The actors may actually use them as part of the business in the scene. We mentioned that cake. Maybe that cake was the entire plot action around this one scene, and therefore that prop becomes very important to that scene. Here's an example of one set that is seen dressed in 3 different ways. Look at the first one and notice that we're very simplistic. We notice the emphasis is probably going to be on characters. We do sense that we are in someone's space and that they live here. In the second picture, we have the same kind of feelings, but we have a totally different feeling about the personality of the people who live in this apartment compared to the one above. The people that live in this one have probably lived there longer, but what we mainly get is a sense of their style and their personality by the way they've dressed their environment. In the third image, we get the sense that someone has just moved out or is just maybe moving in to this space. So the space is fairly neutral and sterile without much personality because it hasn't been established yet or it's been taken away. So who is responsible for the props of a show? Our first key player is the scenic designer. Because the scenic designer helps establish the environment for the characters, the set designer oversees and specifies the look of all the props, and anything that's chosen as a prop is cleared by the set designer. The next person that is important is the prop master or the prop director. This person is the one who will work with the set designer in finding props and actually helping create or acquire them by purchase or by rent or whatever other way we'll talk about later. There's a prop crew that works under the prop master, and they help maintain the props through the run of the show. Obviously, through the natural use of pieces in the action of a play over and over, some pieces might become broken or need to be replaced or need to be cleaned or need to be updated, and it's up to the prop crew to maintain this. They're also the ones that will use the prop list at the top of the show and place all the props where they need to be, and then they will make sure at the end of the show that all the props have come back and are all checked in before everyone leaves. The stage manager is key because the stage manager goes to all the rehearsals and keeps track of what actors are doing in those rehearsals. And some props may have been in the script and some may not have been. Perhaps it's decided that an actor is going to pull out a pocket watch. That's going to be talked about as a hand prop, but it'll be and worked out with the costume designer because it's a costume prop. Or perhaps some actor determines that he wants to carry a fan wherever he goes. That will be worked out by the properties people and maybe again in conjunction with the costume people, so it works with the costume of the character. If it's not important, then the scenic designer and the prop master can be in charge of that decision. And then, of course, the actors. They're the ones that will actually use the props throughout the show, and they have a responsibility for helping maintain them. Many shows actually ask the actors to place props at the top of the show because if they've placed them, they know where they are and they know they're where they need to be. How are props designed? What is that process that we go through? Well, first of all, a master list is created. Something like this piece of paper is used to create a prop list. There'll be a prop number given to each piece, a page from where it comes in the script, a definition of what that prop is, its name, its title, and then a full description and the requirements of what it has to be able to do, a placement of where it might go and what character it might belong to the most in the script, and then some sort of a status mark that lets us know if that prop's in process, if it's going to be constructed, if it's going to be purchased, any other notes that are important for us. Here's an example of a prop list that has been partially filled out for a production of Three Sisters. Prop numbers have not been assigned yet, but we do now have the props. We know how many we need of each one, such as the chair and table. Chairs at the table, number 2, we know we need 13 chairs at that one table. It's on page 2. This prop list is a little different from the last one. It talks about how real it might have to be, if it's needed for rehearsals, and if it's a perishable. That means if it's like a cake and will be eaten and therefore has to be replaced every production. Next, we do the research. We have to decide what the prop has to do and what it should look like. This might be dependent on the period, and we need to make sure that it looks native to the environment of the actors, the time period, the proper location in the world. There needs to be research to make sure that all works. A budget needs to be set, and we need to stay within that budget. So all the props have to fit within the budget that's determined for the production. With that determination, we will decide if we're going to build it or acquire it. Is it going to take longer to build it ourselves than it would be to simply just purchase it somewhere else or borrow it from somewhere else? Then sketches or plans need to be made, particularly if it's going to be built, so that the prop crew knows specifically what they might be looking for as they're pulling or acquiring props. It's nice to have some sort of sketches like these to give a strong designation of what a piece is supposed to look like. Maybe that sketch is not colored yet because we're going to find variations of props in varying colors, and then we can choose after we've found them. We might pull a lot of these things from stock. We can't afford to buy them brand new or create them new every time. We may wind up borrowing them just because it's too expensive to buy them, it's too expensive to build them, and we know someone who already has one of those. Therefore, we will try to borrow or rent them, and perhaps we will wind up having to purchase them just because they're not available any other way. We'll have to determine if they have to be modified, or something that's pulled from stock or borrowed or rented might need to be rehabilitated or repaired, or even repainted or recovered. Some furniture pieces, we recover the furniture with a new fabric so it works better for this particular production. We need to determine if there needs to be a rehearsal prop that actors use until they are finally on stage using the actual prop. Does there need to be a prop that can stand in for that prop? If a prop is used during the rehearsal period, it will probably be used up or maybe broken throughout the rehearsal period. So there may need to be a rehearsal prop version that is used by the actors. Then, once everything is established, we need to run the show. And as the show is running and performing the number of performances it's going to have, we need to make sure that the props are maintained, will last for the full run of the show, or can be replaced as needed during the run of the show. The requirements for props. Does it need to be real or at least feel real? For example, can it be a food prop that's made out of foam rubber? Or something other than actual food that has to be replaced every single performance, because we all know food does deteriorate and cannot be used over and over and over. Therefore, we could have a stand-in that simply sits there and looks like food. That cake, again, in that one scene, may not have been a real cake because it didn't have to be eaten, but it needed to be used multiple times if that were a stage production and there had to be a cake every night. What does it really need to do? Does someone have to pick it up and throw it at somebody, and therefore it has to stay in some sort of form and not break every night? Or does it have to break every night? Perhaps that's what it actually needs to do. We need to determine what the piece needs to do and how to maintain it so it can do that and it doesn't hurt actors. Availability is one of the big choices. Is it available? Can it be rented? Can it be purchased? Can it be built? Can it be... We have to have it, so how can we make it available? And therefore, what does it cost? Some pieces might be terribly expensive. Therefore, they have to be maintained very carefully, and the actors have to be aware that they are very hard to replace. Can it stand up to what has to happen on stage? So I was working on a production of Mary Poppins, and they were dancing with Mary Poppins' umbrella. And they decided as part of the choreography that one actor would hold the top and the bottom of the umbrella, and the actress would hold the middle, and then she would swing around. We would have to have a different umbrella than the one that Mary Poppins actually opens and flies with, because most umbrellas cannot maintain having someone swing on them. Therefore, we had to have a prop umbrella that was used just for that number, that was a rod with fabric around it to make it look like an umbrella. It needs to be safe. We don't need actors to be hurt every night. So often swords that are used on stage are dulled and not actually sharp, just in case they accidentally do strike an actor or a close by audience member. We need to sometimes, as mentioned, have to build or rehabilitate a prop. So the craft skills that are needed by people in the prop areas are probably the widest range of skills in the theater industry. People who work in crafts need to be able to be woodworkers. They need to know how to paint. They need to know how to weld and work with metal. They need to know how to sew. They need to know how to upholster furniture pieces. They need to know electronics so they can make a radio work or a lamp work or some other small, simple electronic piece. They need to know how to make a cast or a copy of something and then make a replica of it, so that they might need multiple pieces that they can reproduce. They may need to know how to carve. They need to make a mold. They need to know many different materials and what they can be used for. And therefore, they usually have a good library of source books that teach them how to make props or where to acquire them. We have specialty props that kind of fall in between categories, such as food props that will be eaten or used during a scene and then have to be used again later on. This is from the film Julie and Julia. Now, as a film, it only really had to be used once as a food item. But what happens if we got halfway through eating that piece and something happened that was wrong and we needed to start the scene over? I am sure there was more than one version of that piece of food available for these actors, just in case they needed to have a backup. Does it have to break, or is it going to be expended? Food props are expended. Sometimes we actually eat them on stage and therefore they have to be replaced. Or sometimes things are broken, or sometimes it has to look like they're broken, or it gets dropped and then people have to walk on it. If that's the case and it has to look like someone's cut in it, we need to make sure we're not using real glass. In this case, this is sugar glass, and it won't actually hurt anybody, but it will give the semblance of a piece that will actually break, and with the actor acting like it's sharp, we can make it appear sharp on stage. Weapons. Weapons are in their own category, and most frequently, if weapons are actually used on stage or on screen, there is a weapons expert available to help train the performers how to use it and how not to use it, so that no one is actually hurt in the process. We also need to make sure that weapons are locked up each night so they're not accessible to anybody else other than the performers for when they're needed. Trick props. Props that have to do or act for themselves. There are props that are puppets in themselves and have to actually move or have a mechanical action, as this mechanical person did in the movie Hugo. And then there are props that cross over, like the plant from Little Shop of Horrors, that is actually in some forms worn as a puppet and in some forms worn as an entire costume. So as it grows, it gets larger and it changes in what it has to be able to do. So this is a crossover piece, and early in the production we have to decide, is the properties department going to be in charge of this piece? Is costumes going to be in charge of this piece? Is scenery going to be in charge of this piece? And for Little Shop of Horrors we might say yes, because maybe it'll be a combination of those areas to help pull off the plant as it grows larger and larger and takes more room. How do we find and get props if we have to acquire them? We have a stock usually of properties that are somewhere in the theater building, and we have a stock that we can therefore pull from. Storage is a major issue because it might cost more to store it than to actually get rid of it and buy a new one the next time the show takes place. But storage is always an issue. We can borrow from another person's stock, another theater close by. We can buy. There are specialty prop manufacturers that actually do a lot of property pieces. Then that's what they do as a profession. We can go to antique dealers and find pieces to help dress a set to make it look more period appropriate by using actual pieces, but we would have to be careful because antiques have great value, and it is pretty dangerous to put something on stage because actors can bump them. Thrift stores often have second use items that we can purchase and use. We might be able to buy something on eBay or find other sources on the internet. We might be able to rent them. There are prop houses, and all they do is rent props. They come in and actually dress sets and films and make them look like they're supposed to look, and that's what they do for a living. We can go online, perhaps, and find rental houses and property outlets that will rent to us. And there might be local. Perhaps there are companies in your neighborhood that stage houses. Often when someone wants to sell a house or a building, they'll dress it. They'll bring in some pieces to make it look very nice, to help the buyer know what it would look like if they actually wanted to dress it that way. These people have a good supply of properties and decorated items, and they might be willing to rent or loan pieces to your theater company. The danger in borrowing is, as we've mentioned, theater is a harsh environment. Actors can get wild on stage and may bump pieces on stage, knock them over, break things accidentally. And actors might have to handle something repeatedly, and that's a lot more use than that item would get in its average life. In running props for a show, the organization is to always maintain a great prop list so that props can be looked at the very beginning of the show to make sure they're all there, and then checked back in at the end of the show to make sure they've all come back. We'll maintain a prop table on which to put them, which is usually tables backstage that are taped out and have specific spaces for all props, and by looking at the table you can see what's there and what is not. Security. Props can tend to walk away because they are made to easily be picked up and carried around. So security means we need to lock up the props each night to make sure no one comes in and borrows or decides to take a prop home because they want a souvenir from the production. Then there's the ongoing run of the show, as we've mentioned before. We may have to go out and purchase foods daily for certain moments in the show. We may need to replace light bulbs because something burns out. So we just need to thoroughly keep checking to make sure everything is maintained for the entire run of the show. Properties is a wonderful area in which to work. It is actually a fairly easy place to get into the professional world because prop people are needed frequently in live theater and in film. So it could be a great place for someone who has a great range of skills in wood and painting and fabrics and is very creative. You might be the perfect properties person. Props.